Whenever my students are learning about factorials, I'm often asked, why is 0 factorial 1? Shouldn't it be 0? And a common explanation is that anytime we have an empty product in math, by convention we define it to be 1. Just like how we define empty sums to be 0. But that explanation doesn't usually sit well with students because it basically amounts to an adult telling them that something is true because I said so. So instead of that, I like to give the following two explanations for why 0 factorial is 1. One method is algebraic, the other approach is more intuitive. But let's start with the algebraic method. So recall that the factorial function is defined like so. N factorial is equal to n times n minus 1 times n minus 2 times n minus 3 all the way down to times 2 times 1 for any non-negative integer n. Now this factorial function can then be generalized to something called the gamma function, which then allows us to input in complex values. But we don't have to get into that for this explanation. Rather, let's just rewrite the factorial function like so. N factorial can now be written as n times n minus 1 factorial. And notice if you now let n equal 1, the left-hand side is 1 factorial, which is 1. But the right-hand side is now equal to 0 factorial. And thus, 0 factorial equals 1. Now that explanation convinces some students, but other students might still feel a bit uneasy because they might think that I'm just manipulating symbols to get to a certain conclusion. So for those students who remain unconvinced, I like to give them this more intuitive explanation. So imagine that you have, let's say, 10 distinct objects, and you want to choose none of them. How many ways are there of doing so? Well, one way. You just don't pick any of them. In other words, 10 choose 0 should be equal to 1. And that is actually further confirmed by the formula for a combination. N choose k is equal to n factorial over n minus k factorial times k factorial. So applying this formula to 10 choose 0, we see that it indeed equals to 1 if and only if the 0 factorial in the denominator also is equal to 1. So the math confirms our intuition. In fact, if you have a group of n distinct objects that you want to arrange in a row, let's say on a shelf, so that the order matters, then there should be n factorial ways of doing so. So for example, if you have a group of 3 objects that you want to arrange in a row on a shelf, then there should be 3 factorial or 6 ways of doing so. And likewise with 2 objects, there should be 2 factorial or 2 ways of doing so. 1 object, you would have 1 factorial or 1 way of doing so. And then by extension, if you have no objects or 0 objects, there should then be 0 factorial or 1 way of arranging no objects on a shelf. You just have that empty shelf or an empty product. So students are usually a little bit more persuaded after that explanation. In any case, I hope that convinces you that 0 factorial is 1. I hope you're doing well. Make sure to hit that follow button for more math content. And as always, I'll catch you on the next one. Take care.